Last time on this deep dive into the ethics of vampire survivors, we discussed the harrowed waters of mental health as it relates to addiction and compulsion around video games, looking particularly at how the sense of flow that most games aim for as one of the central goals of game design can be used to flip the script by trapping people into seeking out that sense of flow as a baseline coping mechanism rather than as an aspect of a meaningful experience. However, in seeing that the concept of flow is not without the potential for harm, it would serve us to examine the idea of the flow state more carefully to decide if flow is in fact a worthwhile goal in the first place. Born in 1934 and having passed away only recently, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi did most of his research and contributions to psychology before any video game was created. During his lifetime, his concept of cognitive flow would become one of the cornerstones of game design from as far back as the accidental invention of scaling difficulty with the game Space Invaders in 1978. Mihai was a psychologist at the forefront of the blossoming field of modern science-based psychology. Psychology in the 19th century, the psychological systems developed by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, were a broad mix of attempts to apply the scientific method to hypotheses that honestly share more in common with philosophy than 21st century psychology. 20th century psychology bridged that gap by prioritizing research, then drawing broad social theories after testing a hypothesis. Applying psychology like this comes with its own pitfalls, but it is a very good step in the right direction. Mihai, having been engrossed by psychology from a young age, and having been inspired by meeting Carl Jung in Switzerland, became a founding voice in the field of positive psychology. It was the end of the heroic age of medicine, still operating under the four humors and the miasma theories of disease. Most 19th century psychology was thus preoccupied with being a means of healing the sick, of healing mental illness. Positive psychology took the opposite approach, being primarily focused on maximizing happiness as a way to combat sorrow and tragedy. If you imagine psychology to be medicine, then positive psychology would be imagined as prevention through nutrition and exercise. Quote, "The best moments of our lives are not the passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur if a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile." Mihai, 1990. Cognitive flow, from its outset, was a concept that was dictated not by play, but rather in the context of developing skills and improving one's ability to work. When gamers discuss the concept of flow, we invariably turn to this specific chart. This version of the Mihai cognitive flow chart focuses on the development of skill. It demonstrates that if a person's skill is matched with challenges presented to that skill, a state of flow will result. It can happen for low challenge and low skill experiences and high challenge, high skill experiences, and it is precisely because the flow state is also the state in which one's ability to improve at a skill is at its peak that we focus on this with theories of game design. Because video games are designed with a kind of beginning, middle, and end, we can think of every video game as its own unique skill that needs to be learned and mastered. We subconsciously can apply a dimension of time to this flowchart. We start a game expecting to be unskilled and experience a low level of difficulty that gradually ramps us up to high difficulty and high skill at the end of the game's experience. A hypothetically perfectly paced game is one in which you experience flow from the moment you begin playing to the very end of the experience, because the game stays balanced throughout. This concept breaks down somewhat because players can never be assumed to come at a game with the same skill level. Difficulty modes were invented specifically because developers needed a way to solve for that ignorance of the starting point of the player. whilst other games did take on different perspectives and goals. Arcade games were designed specifically to be easy to start, hooking the player for a predetermined amount of time, then spiking the difficulty to fail the player off of the machine and collect another quarter from the next player. Developers like Bethesda Game Studios relied on universal dynamic difficulty scaling so that the player will face the same challenge based entirely on their level, as a measure of how long the player has developed their skill. Developers like From Software decided that rather than usher the player through the early stages, they would allow the difficulty to start high in order to create the feeling of struggling to develop a skill at first, and finally reaching flow after a long and frustrating experience. You can even see its influence in GDC talks, such as this 2019 talk by a designer of Devil May Cry 5, Hideaki Itsuno, presenting how he conceptualized the pacing of DMC5. Clearly, this is a Mihai cognitive flowchart, laid on top of the experience of a game that treats the post-credits, the bonus scene after the conclusion of the story, as the peak of the game's experience of flow. However, game design theories have limited themselves somewhat by only relying on this depiction of the concept of flow. Flow is a subjective emotional experience, not just a byproduct of the development of a skill. The other Mihai flowchart is designed to help a person visualize the subjective emotional experience of how skill and challenge interact. Looking at this expression of the concept of flow places it as just one among three positive feelings associated with high skill: flow, control, and relaxation. Then there are two more neutral feelings associated with moderate skill experiencing a challenge. It shows a spectrum of boredom when the challenge is low, and general arousal or attentiveness when the challenge is high. Finally, three negative feelings: apathy when both skill and challenge are low, worry or moderate anxiety when skill is low and a challenge is high, and high anxiety when the skill is low and the challenge is significantly greater. Here we can see that Mihai's positive psychology recognizes more than just the state of flow as a desirable outcome of developing high skill at a specific task. This can reveal how players like Video Games Are Bad can express feelings of relaxation when playing a game like Vampire Survivors. The challenge of the game stays consistent throughout, and so a player that invests enough attention to become skilled or knowledgeable in a way that exceeds that challenge can find themselves having a positive experience with something that is no longer challenging, but familiar. The simplicity of the game adding to its medium when taken with the context that Vampire Survivors stood as the most popular game to play on the Valve Steam Deck. Video Games Are Bad's focus on the context of when something becomes a valuable experience to the player is tantamount here. Understanding the concept of cognitive flow with just a snapshot of a specific perspective causes us to lose that context when thinking about a game's design. Flow is not just about the development of skill, nor is it just about the emotional experience of tackling a challenge. It has, in fact, a categorical definition of 8 different factors. Quote, complete concentration on the task, clarity of goals and reward in mind and immediate feedback, transformation of time, speeding up or slowing down. The experience is intrinsically rewarding, effortlessness and ease. There is a balance between challenge and skill. Actions and awareness are merged, losing self-conscious rumination. There is a feeling of control over the task. Some of these characteristics are descriptive, like the changing perception of time or the quieting of self-consciousness. Some of these characteristics are prescriptive, like the concentration on a task or the balancing of challenge and skill. The factor that I wish to focus on now is the fourth, as it is self-prescriptive. It is subjective. The experience is intrinsically rewarding. That which we can consider intrinsically rewarding is primarily about what each person decides is meaningful and valuable to them. There is a relationship between the experience of flow and the act of finding value in an act. Flow cannot exist without first imparting that sense of value. Video games, as a unitary piece of art, must first convince someone to make the decision that the experience is valuable through play, before a player can reach a state of flow through the development of their knowledge and skill around the game. As such, a player has the opportunity to decide for themselves, at the beginning of the experience, if a game and its design has that value to their subjective sense of value. In the previous section on video games and compulsion, we discussed how something like playing a video game or gambling on a slot machine becomes a disease, becomes similar to an addiction. In these circumstances, Mihai's concept of flow becomes a baseline. Experiencing anything less than flow becomes anxious, boring, and painful, while reaching flow itself no longer comes with the happiness and elation it once had as the highest expression of a skill. There's no getting around the seriousness of this reality. People experiencing compulsions that act as a severe detriment to their life and livelihoods need understanding, resources, and support to help them out of these harmful patterns of behavior. What I can say, as a person who is in one way neurodivergent, I am on the autism spectrum, I have experienced mild expressions of compulsion. There have been times in my life when incessantly playing Warframe was the only thing that got me through tough times. There have also been times when playing Warframe got in the way of me developing new relationships or finding a way out of tough situations. I have put down the game for good and returned to it a handful of times. Writing this in December of 2022, I am currently in a time where Warframe is the main game I play when I get home from work, and I use creating videos about cultural influence of the game to measure what value the game gives me. The key difference between these times were changing my perspective on what within the game was a worthwhile experience versus a waste of time. I have also experienced obsessive dedication to work and hustle culture back in 2017, working 10 and 12-hour days driving rideshare, filling all of my free time checking YouTube analytics and making videos, with nothing to show for it but a few ad revenue pennies and the occasional Patreon supporter. I made the choice to distance myself almost entirely from YouTube right about the time my big video on the philosophy of Warframe breathed new life into the channel. In her commentary on Vampire Survivors, the person who inspired this series of videos also highlights how Mihai's flow scale was inherently researched with the intent of improving the efficiency and duration a person could work, but did not highlight how that reason was also meant to transform work culture from largely meaningless activities to activities that a person would find valuable. In their video Game Work, YouTuber Games and Culture highlights how the research into playing games shows that it is far more similar to engaging in work than to engaging in gameless activities more traditionally associated with play. Play, from engineering jargon, is time wasted or energy spent frivolously. Yet, when creating the metaphorical machine of a video game, the act of work is precisely that which we colloquially call play. Work is what we call fun. Games and Culture uses games like Stardew Valley and Call of Duty to highlight how games juxtapose work that one might find meaningful from work one would find meaningless. It is precisely because video games are works of art, because they can abstract the processes of work away from their materially productive function in society, that we can use them toward meaningful ends other than productivity and capital. Work is not inherently bad. Meaningless work, junk work, work that is both personally valueless and provides little compensation, is the kind of work that leads to ennui and the disillusionment of one's chosen purpose. Applying positive psychology to work means to do away with the kind of junk work that creates those feelings, in favor of work that has intrinsic value, in favor of work that is likely to produce flow. It would be an overstep to say that anyone can determine externally what work a person subjectively decides for themselves has intrinsic value as an activity. Again, personal responsibility plays a role in determining if work is meaningful, and thus also if any specific kind of game is meaningful. In my own books, I have highlighted the misconceptions of conceiving work and play as dichotomies, as opposites. Games are often studied as play, designed for work, and engaged by players as voluntary work rather than through the emotional lens of the feeling of fun, the lens of feeling good. Work and play intrinsically overlap. In the time of all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, the key that positive psychology, engineering, game design, and the psychology of play were all missing is that play is the very act of learning a skill, that games are inherently a kind of work. They are simply better versions of the pedagogic view of education or the survival-entrenched labor of economics. This is because play and games are primarily concerned with what we have freely decided is intrinsically rewarding. Flow is not a proof of harmful intent or compulsive design. It is the peak experience of finding meaning in the activity of play. While we should always be mindful of games that wish to artificially shepherd a person into the harmful dynamic of compulsion, we would do well to remember that pursuing flow in the creation of the game is itself an expression of the meaningful experience the developers of games wish to convey to their players. These may not be harmful experiences to everyone. Different people have different tastes and different values, but we can easily imagine that any game can be a meaningful experience to someone. Stay true.